Welcome, friends, to another edition of Economic Update. I want to welcome you because this has been a very full week of things to report to you about on this program brought to you by Pacifica Network every week to help us understand the economy, incomes, jobs, pay scales, debts, the whole ball of wax. I'm particularly excited because I have with me as our guest today, Chris Hedges. And as we usually do, about 15 minutes into the program, we'll begin what I'm sure will be a very interesting interview with him. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. I've been a professor of economics all my life at several universities. Currently, I'm a visiting professor in the graduate program for international affairs at the New School University here in New York City. And I also write regularly for several outlets, including truthout.org, a remarkable independent source of news and analysis that you can look at truthout.org, and I urge you to do so. Please keep sending us your questions and comments. We use them not only to pick a few to answer, as I will later today, but also to help us design the program in terms of our guests and our coverage so that it meets your needs, your interests, and your desires. Send your questions, as always, either to my website, rdwolf.com, or to the website of our larger project, democracyatwork.info. Either way, they will get to us. Well, let me begin, as I try to often this week, with some of the good news. Well, at least it's good for some folks. I thought you'd like to keep up with some of the statistics about executive pay packages. It's always a moment to imagine how other people live. So I thought I'd begin by telling you about the good luck of Alan Mulally, the head of the Ford Motor Company. Over recent years, like with all our car companies, the Ford Motor Company has required concessions, they're called, give-backs in simpler language, from their working people in the way of wages, in the way of pension, and other kinds of benefits. So imagine how much better it would be, if you hadn't figured it out already, to be the head of the corporation. Alan Mulally's pay package for 2012 came just shy of $21 million. That was his personal reward, and to give you an idea, it's double what his counterpart at Daimler-Benz in Germany got, and it really shows up the head of Toyota, who got a mere $1.48 million last year. But Mr. Mulally has actually done better. Over the years, the last 5 years that his workers have taken concessions, he's been accumulating shares of Ford Motor stock, and according to CNN Money, which is a good source, he's amassed, quote, holdings valued at more than $300 million. Not too bad. Back in 1986, Forbes magazine noted that the 10 highest paid CEOs in the United States together drew down $58 million. Not shabby back in 1986. But compared to how they're doing in 2012, small change. Instead of $58 million, the top 10 in 2012, $616.4 million pay, according to Forbes magazine. Over the same period of time, same 26 years, average real weekly wages for American workers stayed the same, more than doubling the real wages of the folks at the top, while those at the bottom got the same. Wow. Here's a comparison to a country that's doing a little something about this. In France, the newly elected socialist government of François Hollande passed a law which went as follows. In the 52 companies, major companies in France, where the government has a majority stake of the stocks of the company, that is the case in France, there's now a law. No executive can get more than 450,000 euros per year. That's about $580,000 here in the United States. You obviously won't be poor, but you're not going to get tens of millions, and that might be something some of you might want to pursue. I also found another statistic I thought would be of interest to you. Last week, President Obama announced that he's going to give back $20,000 of the $400,000 a year he gets because of solidarity with the public employees that he's firing or furloughing, as people prefer to say these years. So the president gets $400,000 or $380,000 if he gives back the $20,000, as he said. How does that compare with CEOs in the United States? I thought you might be interested to know. And what first piqued my interest, and here I want to thank Sam Pizzigatti, who puts out a very useful thing called TooMuchOnline.org. Go visit his weekly newsletter. It's full of tidbits like this one. And he said, well, he took a look at the Danaher Corporation. It's a conglomerate that does a lot of things, including electronics. Their chief executive last year, Larry Culp, C-U-L-P, is the latest CEO to join the club of CEOs who earn more than $100 million in a year. He came in at $106.4 million. And that works out to the following. Larry Culp makes in one day what the President of the United States makes in a year. Worth a thought. Was it always this way? No. From the 1930s to the 1970s, Sam Pizzigatti points out, presidents routinely took in less than average CEOs. In fact, Richard Nixon's 1970 paycheck trumped the CEO average by $45,000. The president got $45,000 more than your average CEO. Last year, 2012, the average CEO pay was 24 times the payment of President Obama. Something must be going on in a country which pays the people that run politics so much less than the people that run the business that in the end runs the politics. The biggest news this last week was Social Security. And after much advanced publicity, President Obama revealed to us that, yes, it was true. He was going to propose cuts to Social Security. It's a little complicated because what they're doing is changing the rule whereby they calculate how much your Social Security should go up each year to take account of the rising prices we have to pay for the goods and services we consume. They're using the chained system. It's a little different from what they have been using, but the important point is it means the adjustments will now be smaller than they used to be. In effect, they're cutting the Social Security benefits going forward compared to what they had been. What do we say about this? Well, number one, Social Security is a system that is enjoying a surplus, and it has for many years. What does that mean? More money is paid into Social Security every year, and that's been true for many years. More money is paid in by people working and having that money withheld from their paycheck than is being used to take care of the old people who are eligible for Social Security help. So the system is perfectly functioning and in the black. It's bringing in much more money that is paying out. That's true. So by the government cutting benefits, they're making the surplus larger than it already was, because less money will be going out to people while there's no diminution in the money coming in. Why would they do that? Because the way Social Security works is, if the Social Security takes in more than it needs, which it's been doing, that extra is folded into the budget of the United States government. It's in fact a disguised way of taxing people, but you don't call it a tax. You call it Social Security. You make people think they're contributing to their own retirement sum, but you secretly take the surplus for the government's needs, and then, final blow, you cut what you give them, which is what President Obama proposed yesterday. Why is this important? Because this is the third leg of the American austerity program. Reminder, austerity is when you have an economic crisis, such as the one that hit in 2007, and you respond to it by bailing out banks, insurance companies, and large corporations with huge amounts of money, which is what we did in 2008, 9, 10, and continuing. And then you discover, oh my goodness, the crisis is hurting the economy, and the bailouts are draining money out of the government. We have to do something, and austerity is when what you decide to do is make the mass of people pay for the crisis they didn't call and cause, and for the bailouts they didn't get. And how do you do that? You suck more money out of their pockets. You tax them more, and you spend less on social programs. January 1st of this year, we hit the mass of people with an increase in their taxes. We raised the payroll tax from 4.2% of everybody's paycheck. January 1, 4.2 was what it was all last year. We raised it to 6.2%. That's a huge increase. It brings the government $120, $130 billion per year more. And whom does that tax fall on? Middle and lower income people. That's a real austerity punch in the nose. By the way, both of our presidential candidates were full of conversation during the campaign. Protect the middle class, revive the middle class, support the middle class. And what did the two parties agree to on January 1, now that the election was a couple of months behind them? They agreed to whack the middle and lower income people in America, the majority, with a tremendous increase in the payroll tax, a regressive tax. It doesn't go up the higher your income. And it only taxes the first $113,000 that anybody earns. If you earn more than $113,000, if you're one of those executives I just talked about, you're great, because the increase in the payroll tax only affects the first $113,000 anybody earns. Every dollar above that pays no payroll tax. Not the old 4.2, not the new 6.2, zilch. How nice for them. So we hit the mass of people with an austerity by raising the payroll tax January 1. Then on March 1st, we had the sequester. What is that? Cutting back outlays of government for social programs, which people need now because of the crisis more than ever. So we're taking money away from social programs as we take more money out of people's pockets. And now the third leg of austerity, we're cutting off the old people. We're reducing the amount of money we're giving them. These are programs to make the mass of people pay in higher taxes, in foregone social programs, to support a crisis that has already hurt them and that they didn't cause, and to pay for the bailouts they didn't get. There's no way to make that pretty. It's ugly. Last thing that we have time for. Also last week, the death was reported of the only female prime minister I believe Britain has ever had, Maggie Thatcher. She was the prime minister in the 1980s, most famous for right-wing things she said and did. What finally did her in was a poll tax. That's a tax on everybody regardless of their ability to pay. That was so upsetting even to her own Conservative Party that they pushed her out. But she was famous for many things. And one of them was a line that said, socialism is good until you run out of other people's money. So I thought, let's talk about that and explain it because it's still with us. Her idea is this, that the people who provide jobs are the rich and the corporations, and that what average people need and want are jobs and incomes. So, she reasoned, if what people want are jobs and incomes, and if the people who give them jobs and incomes are the rich and the corporations, then everything we do for the rich and corporations is good because it will mean we're giving money to the people who create the jobs that everybody wants. Nice argument. So she took away from the bottom, the poor, the middle class, and gave it to the rich in hopes that they would create the jobs. And this should all sound familiar to my American audience, because it's another way of saying that the corporations and the rich are job creators, and that's very popular today. So let's take a look. How well did the job creation program of taking money from the middle and the poor and giving it to the rich so they would create jobs and income, how did it work? Britain is today a basket case. They have had a crisis like we have had since 2007, but with this difference. They've had 2 recessions within the crisis, and they're now looking at the 3rd. They're a disaster, and part of that is the progress and the result and the legacy of Maggie Thatcher. And what about here in the United States, where Mrs. Thatcher had a partner, Ronald Reagan? Same story. We're looking at a transfer of wealth from middle and low to the top. And how have they done? Have they created a lot of jobs? We have more unemployment today than we have had since the Great Depression. So no, we are not in a position to say it worked. It didn't. And not only do we not have the jobs, do we have a bigger unemployment than ever, but I thought you might like to have me end with a statistic about the jobs we have that in fact have been created. And we won't talk anymore about all those that haven't been, which undercut all of this ideology of the right that helping the rich solves the problem. Here's a statistic that I got from the Economic Policy Institute in Washington in an article they recently released called The Class of 2013. I'm going to talk about health insurance provided by your employer for your job and a pension. And I'm going to compare 1989, the end of the Reagan-Thatcher period, to today, or at least the most recent statistics, 2011. I'm going to start with college graduates, and then I'm going to talk about high school graduates. What percentage of college graduates had a health insurance program provided by their employer in 1989? 60%. 60% of college graduates had health insurance at their job. In 2011, 31.1%. Half the people who had health insurance with their job in 1989 now have a job without it. Wow. What a drop. The jobs were created, but little detail, not with health insurance. For high school graduates, of course, the story is always worse. In 1989, 23.5% had health insurance with their job. By 2011, 7.1% of high school graduates got a job with health insurance. And the numbers on pensions are similar. If you were a college graduate in 1989, 30% of you got a pension with your job. 70% got no pension. And by 2011, it was down to 27%. Fewer people. About a quarter of college graduates had any pension at all. And among high school graduates in 1989, 12% had a pension. In 2011, 5.9%. Those are the jobs that are created by the people we call job creators. Let me turn now with great pride to my guest for today, Chris Hedges. And I want to introduce him to you and welcome him to the program. Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, the author of 11, count them, 11 books, including his New York Times bestseller, which he co-wrote with the cartoonist Joe Sacco. And it has a title, and it has been very widely read and praised, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. Chris, welcome very much to the program.
Thanks, Richard.
Okay, let's jump right in for our guests.
Can I just throw in something,
Please.
Comment on Maggie Thatcher?
Please.
It's not just all the points that you made, which are important, but she would privatize public industries, like, for instance, public transportation. So you have now a group created by Maggie Thatcher called, I think it's called First Group, that owns all the buses. And they bought Greyhound. They own, I think, 60,000. They run 60,000 of our roughly 500,000 school buses in the United States under a subsidiary called First Group. And the fact is that what these private corporations then go do is they break labor unions and they force people to work for subsistent wages. So it's not just that they're not creating jobs, as you point out, but the jobs they do create are such that because workers have no protection, no rights, no benefits, and inadequate wages, reduce essentially those who are working to subsistence level or poverty level. I think that's a really important.
Yes, yes. And she like Reagan, made a big point of attacking labor, of suggesting that all of the social welfare, all of the New Deal achievements should be rolled back, were counterproductive. And so she gets the credit with Reagan of kind of bringing in the new wave, of making it ideologically acceptable in the society to treat people like that and to reorganize the economy?
I blame a lot on television.
Tell us.
Well, because everything, as we are transformed from a society that's print-based, and I worked for many years at the New York Times, to an image-based society. You saw, even as a news reporter for the New York Times, if you're writing an 800-word column about a particular decision, there is a tremendous superficiality that comes with it. I was a foreign correspondent. You couldn't, in 7 years in the Middle East, you couldn't understand the Israel-Palestine conflict unless you understood the history of the Middle East going back to the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, Sykes-Picot, the British mandate in Palestine, the Balfour Declaration. None of it made any sense. And as we lose that sort of capacity to put events in context, as we lose, we in essence create this kind of historical vacuum, we end up with a situation where everything is reduced to this kind of childish sloganeering. Government isn't part of the solution, government's part of the problem. We need to balance we need a balanced federal budget just because you balance your checkbook in the House. Well, in my house, we don't print our own money. Yeah. It's this utter simplification. Right. And I think that figures like Reagan, in particular, who were, he came out of the advertising. He was an actor who then, of course, is an advertiser for GE, right, and used quite consciously to destroy Truman's proposal of universal health care. It was Ronald Reagan that, and not only that, in naming names and HUAC and everything else. But these people are politicians/advertisers. They have a good way of imparting a kind of physical warmth along with these childish, simplistic, finally ridiculous or absurdist slogans that in an age of television, where everything is reduced to a couple minutes, where you don't get shows like this anymore, right, work, because you can't, even if you challenge that absurdity, there isn't enough space or time to do anything more than answer in the pre-approved cliche of quote-unquote the other side. So I blame a lot of it, of their success, because the whole idea of kneeling before the marketplace, as if the terms of the marketplace should dictate how we construct human society, there's nothing in, 3,000 years of economic history to justify this insanity. And yet that is in essence what we've done, this utopian belief that if we slavishly serve the interests of the market, and the figures I think you read out show, the kind of disparity and insanity of what we've done, you're going to create a better society. And then you get popularizers like Francis Fukuyama or Tom Friedman or others, but these people are in advertising, really, anymore. They're no longer they no longer deal in ideas, they no longer deal in information, and I think that is what we've suffered from.
Yeah, I think, I often investigate my own activity and try to understand why, for example, we were talking before, why the audiences are getting larger for me. I'm very pleased and flattered. But I think part of whatever it is I'm doing is filling exactly the gap you talk. I try to explain what's going on, and people are so exhausted by the fragmentary, disconnected nature of what passes for economic news that anyone who stops a little bit and sort of explains and puts a context is appreciated for giving you some sense of what's going on.
Yeah, even I read the front page story about the assault on Social Security, which you mentioned before, in the New York Times, and they're even using the word entitlement. Yes. Now that's just, right, you can't use a word. Entitlement is something that, you're given. We pay into Social Security. It's not an entitlement, it's an investment. And yet, that corruption of language is important because it creates...
that it's some kind of a gift.
Yes, it creates this false impression of what the program is quite effectively. It's, I speak at a lot of universities, and it's always interesting comparing. If I go to a university like Skidmore or something, or NYU, where students largely come from the financial elite and believe, probably in many increasingly numbers, fatuously, that they're headed for the 1%, there's not much interest in what I say. And yet, when I go to a university, I spoke at Youngstown State, it was not only packed, they were seated down the aisles because they get it. Their parents have lost jobs. The average age at Youngstown State is in the middle to late 20s because they've lost jobs. They have taken out tremendous loans in a very desperate gamble to try and get themselves back into an economic situation where they can sustain themselves and their families. And so they've asked the hard questions that within the elite universities they haven't asked yet because they still believe that they are going to be funneled. And in some cases, and I've taught at Princeton, they will be funneled into these systems. But I think that point that you raise is because if you're a student at Youngstown State, if your parents have lost their unemployment benefits because we didn't extend them, if you have lost your jobs, if you are taking out, $80,000, $70,000, $80,000 in debt, you begin to ask the right questions that the corporatized systems of information have shut out. And, I began as a journalist in the 1980s in Central America. And I have watched over that time period the utter destruction of a profession or a trade that I care about. And, critiquing the commercial press is something that I can do and have done in my book, Death of the Liberal Class. And yet, I think as Sidney Schanberg says, the commercial press, newspapers like the New York Times, they may not have always made things better, but they stop things from getting worse. That's, I think, fair. But with the destruction of print-based journalism, the destruction of reporting, the domination of an image-based, and most of these images, of course, are skillfully controlled by corporations, we're entering a kind of a very frightening system whereby it is becoming exceedingly difficult for people to get anything more than the kind of court gossip. I mean, and MSNBC is just as guilty of this as Fox. I mean, they just spin the same absurd court gossip, what Sarah Palin said or whatever, but from a different angle.
Right.
And the lie that they tell is the lie of omission, which is still a lie. It's what they don't discuss. Right. I sued Barack Obama over Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act, and we won. I was joined by Noam Chomsky, Daniel Ellsberg, Alex O'Brien, a few other plaintiffs. We won in September in the Southern District Court of New York. And then it went to the Second Circuit. The Obama administration appealed it. And for viewers and listeners, the Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act permits the U.S. military to detain American citizens, strip them of due process, hold them in military facilities, including our offshore penal colonies, our black sites, until, in the language of that section, the end of hostilities, which in an age of permanent war is probably the rest of your life. And who can be seized? People who substantially support. Now, that's not a legal term. That's not material support. Substantially support al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or something called associated forces. And when Judge Catherine Forrest in the Southern District Court asked the government lawyers, can you guarantee me that Mr. Hedges will not be caught up in this provision, they couldn't do it. And so the government lawyers in the appeal took a different tack and said, the actual quote was, Mr. Hedges has nothing to worry about as long as he doesn't start driving black vans for people we don't like. And the courtroom laughed. But I didn't think it was very funny. Right. Because what it is they will define, in their words, what is quote-unquote independent journalism and what is not. And if you don't fall within that rubric, then you can be seized. There's no provision, of course, this is why I sued them with the lawyers Carl Mayer and Bruce Saffron. There's no provision in there to protect journalists. And having covered for 5 years the war in El Salvador during the Reagan administration, I saw how the officials linked us, and I also covered Nicaragua, to the FMLN rebels in El Salvador and the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. In the rhetoric of the Reagan administration, there was no difference in their eyes from the work that I was doing as a journalist, because I traveled with the FMLN and traveled with the Sandinistas, and the goals of groups that they had defined as terrorist groups. So I'd already seen the rhetoric. And MSNBC never mentioned the NDAA. Fox, of course, didn't mention it because it has this bipartisan imprimatur. The sponsors of the bill were Carl Levin, a Democrat, and John McCain, a Republican. And so, what we've created is this horrifying system that passes for information, but is really about info entertainment and emotional gratification and salacious celebrity gossip and garbage. Watching the NDAA case, which since 9/11 is probably the most important challenge to the security state. Well, Judge Forrest's decision is a first ruling that opposes the right or the belief that the executive branch can serve as judge, jury, and executioner against American citizens. And the only paper that covered it was my former employer, the New York Times. They covered the trial, and when Judge Forrest issued her decision, they wrote an editorial supporting her decision. But they were utterly alone. And that, for me, was a window into how incredibly impoverished the media landscape has become, and why, if you actually want to grapple with the kind of questions that you raised earlier, and that are important, and that actually mean something to people's lives, you increasingly cannot find it anywhere.
In the mass media.
On the mass media, including on the quote-unquote, liberal cable channel MSNBC, which I think is just as bad as Fox News.
We're going to take a short break, as we do in the middle of the program. Please come back when we will continue to talk with Chris Hedges about his views and his understanding of where we're going domestically, foreign, economics, and politics. Stay with us. Welcome back. This is Economic Update. I'm Richard Wolff with my guest today, Chris Hedges. And picking up where we left off, let me ask Chris if he might give us a glimpse of the book he's now working on, at the same time that he focuses on something I know on many people's mind, and that is, given the austerity, given the crisis, given the ugliness of the bailouts going to so few, given the fact that the so-called recovery is really about the stock market and the rich and leaving everybody else behind, tell us from where you sit, given what you've just said about the media, what are the chances for a kind of movement from below, at least say as strong as what happened in the 1930s with the CIO, the socialists, and the communists? But how would it look today? Where can it come from? And how do you see Occupy Wall Street in relationship to any of that?
Well, when Joe and I wrote Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, the title was always Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. And when I write a book, the next book tends to come out of the last book. So Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt came out of Death of the Liberal Class, which was the collapse of the pillars of the liberal establishment. The press, the liberal church, which I come out of, I'm a seminary graduate, the Democratic Party, labor, culture, which has been destroyed, and Chomsky's critique, I think, of the function of the liberal class is correct. It's a safety valve. It acts to adjust the system, to ameliorate the suffering from below, so that when Conrad Black writes his biography of Roosevelt, he says that Roosevelt's greatest achievement is that he saved capitalism. That's what the liberal class does in a capitalist democracy, while at the same time creating the parameters by which acceptable critique is permissible, so that you can never critique the virtues of the system or the leaders. You can say, well, Vietnam, as Schlesinger did, Vietnam failed, but it was, built on good intentions. That's acceptable. We just lost Tony Lewis, who I knew and I liked Tony, but he did the same, had the same function. When you stepped outside that and you said, no, Vietnam or Iraq, Afghanistan is part of a long continuum of the use of reprehensible forms of violence, whether it's in the Philippines, whether it's in Cuba, whether it's in the Dominican Republic, to further the interests of the capital class. And I just, let me just personally throw in an aside. My family's been here a very long time. We founded East Hampton, New York in 1633, and branches of my family became very wealthy. And they became very wealthy because after the conquest of Cuba in 1898, because they were part of the oligarchic elite, they went in there and carved up the Hedges family. I'm not directly descended from them, but they're part of the clan. They were the largest landowners in Cuba. But it's a window into how that system works, how empire works. And so when you begin that kind of critique, as Howard Zinn did, then you're immediately shut down. And the people who shut you down are the liberal elite, because that's their job. That's how they get tenure-track positions. That's how they get fancy awards. That's how they get grants. That's how they get endowments. and that's how they become morally bankrupt. And so the liberal class is gone. The corporate state, in its myopia, destroyed it, which was very foolish of them.
Yes.
Because that was the mechanism by which they could make incremental or piecemeal reform possible. Now the mechanism's broken. Now corporations can commodify everything, including the natural world, which they are very rapidly destroying in the name of their quarterly profit. And so, because there are no limits, because as Marx understood, unfettered capitalism is a revolutionary force, which is Marx. Better not talk about Marx in front of you, so you can correct my understanding of Marx later. But it has built within it that quality of self-annihilation.
Absolutely.
Because there are no self-imposed limits. So 40% of the summer Arctic sea ice melts, and it's a business opportunity for Shell.
That's right.
It's the death throes of the planet. It's insane. It's like we're all in Herman Melville's Moby Dick, we're all on the Pequod. And Ahab's in charge. And Stubb and Starbuck and Flask, they all know that it's suicide. And they don't stop. That's really where we are.
So what are the chances in that scenario?
It means that the ruling class always determines the configuration of rebellion, of response. And you see it in column after column, Paul Krugman pleading for a rational response to the economic crisis.
Right.
I saw Paul. I said, what if the elite can't respond rationally? You are appealing to a system that I don't believe has the capacity to respond rationally. And his answer was, it doesn't matter. Climate change is going to get us anyway. So you have a situation where if you wanted to blunt a movement rationally, then that would have been a moratorium on foreclosures and bank repossessions. It would have been a forgiveness of student debt. It would have been universal health care. And it would have been a serious, $1 trillion something jobs program, especially targeted.
Federal jobs.
Right, at people under the age of 25. That would have been rational.
And a parallel to what was done in the 30s when the pressure came.
And that would have broken any kind of unrest. But the corporate state is so unplugged from the reality. And remember, these people, when you earn that kind of money, you don't live in America. I think a New Yorker writer called it Richistan. You don't fly commercial jets. The only service people working class people you ever meet are bowing and scraping around you because they want to make sure they can continue to work in your garden or drive your car. And so you get this elite that in psychological, intellectual, and emotional terms live in the equivalent of the Forbidden City or Versailles. They don't know what's going on. They have not a clue. And that's very dangerous because they push and push and push until there is... So I know something's coming. And Occupy was the first, and I was very involved in Occupy, and we can critique Occupy, but I was a great supporter of it. The Occupy was the emergence of that expression. And it's there. It's people forget that Rosa Parks got on the bus, I think, refused to give up her seat in 1954 or 1955. The Freedom Rides didn't start till 1961. When you look at the history of social movements, it's not some kind of straight trajectory upwards. And there's a great book on King and the civil rights movement by Garrow called Burying the Cross, where he nails that out. There were all sorts of failures, Albany, Mississippi, all sorts of actions that were taken. And the Black Power movement at the end, King was a very lonely figure, like Malcolm. And so the idea that, it's just one success after another shows an utter misunderstanding of how social movements work. It is the ruling class that will always determine whether or not there will be revolt. And when the ruling class, as ours is as corrupt, decayed, and distant from the majority of the population, then it becomes very volatile. So something's coming. And I've covered movements. I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania. I covered the street demonstrations that brought down Slobodan Milosevic. I covered both of the Palestinian uprisings or Intifada. And having just spent 2 years in literally the poorest pockets of the United States, as a reporter, something's coming. But what sets it off? It's usually very banal. and unpredictable.
So who would have imagined those people setting up tents in Zuccotti Park would do it?
You never know.
Can you, and I know it's an act of imagination, but precisely because of your experience, give us your imaginary of how this might unfold here.
Well, something will happen that will tip the balance, and it will be probably completely mundane. It will be, an elderly woman in Utah is about to be foreclosed from her home and commit suicide, or something. I mean, it will be something minor. And people will just say, that's enough.
All the accumulated things they've seen and heard.
Because, yes, it's that spark. It's like the Palestinian uprising. It was caused by a traffic accident, the first one, where there were day workers, they were hit by a truck, 7 of them. The PLO didn't know it was coming. Nobody knew it was coming. I mean, I always tell the story of being in Leipzig on November 9th, 1989, with the leaders of the East German opposition. And they said, maybe within a year, we will have free passage back and forth across the Berlin Wall. Within a few hours, the Berlin Wall, as an impediment to human traffic, did not exist. Even they don't know. When I covered all the demonstrations that brought down Milosevic, I knew Djindjic, I knew all those guys, Draskovic. I'd be up in the back room before they'd walk out on the balcony with 100,000 people. They were frantic. Once those movements begin, you're hanging on by the tail. They have a kind of life force of their own. And so, because the ruling elite, will keep, in essence, harvesting the country. Everything. I mean, nothing's sacrosanct anymore. They want everything. Why do hedge fund managers want to go into inner city neighborhoods? Because the government spends about $600 billion on education. They want it, and they'll get it. Just like they want the Social Security money. And they know no limits. And because they know no limits, eventually, you keep jabbing people with a stick. But what will it look like? And let's not forget that there are very powerful proto-fascist movements in this country that are violent. The lunatic fringe of the Republican Party, maybe the whole party has gone lunatic, the Tea Party, the militia, and that, in essence, what we live under is a system of political paralysis, an inability on the part of government to function, at least on behalf of the citizenry. Right. And that creates a situation where, and it's one of the reasons why I supported Nader. I wrote many of Nader's policy speeches for him in 2008, and voted for him and voted for the Green Party, because what happens is and I saw this in Yugoslavia, with the breakdown of Yugoslavia, and the war in Yugoslavia was caused by the economic meltdown of Yugoslavia. It had nothing to do with ancient ethnic hatreds. Those are just used, what Freud calls the narcissism of minor difference. What happens is that you have self-identified liberals like Obama, who's not a liberal in any traditional sense at all, nor was Clinton. They speak in that feel your pain language, but have utterly betrayed the core values of liberal capitalist democracy. And so what happens is the longer the paralysis continues, the more the rage grows. And when these people, the center, are discredited, unfortunately, and we saw this in Weimar, is that what happens is that the values they purport to represent are also rejected. And that's my fear, that those of us who don't care about those values have failed to stand up for them, as the liberal class has, by supporting Clinton, who made war on the working class, as has Obama, that these proto-fascist movements are easily recruited and funded by the most retrograde elements of American capitalism, the Koch brothers and others. And they do what fascist movements do. They speak in the language of violence. They channel a legitimate sense of rage and betrayal towards the vulnerable. Muslims, undocumented workers, homosexuals, intellectuals, liberals, feminists, a very long list of people they hate. And that is also part of American culture. My wife's Canadian, so I'm in Canada, and that's not part of the Canadian fabric, but it is part of the American fabric.
As a final, because we're running out of time, as a final thing, so am I reading you right, that we have a peculiar irony? The dominant capitalist business community and the wealthy who sit on the top of it, having destroyed the opposition, the labor movement, the old social organizations, socialists, and all the rest, are now kind of in a hysterical forward rush doing what they do without an opposition, creating such antipathy that it is either going to go to the right with all the forces you enunciated, right, or there's going to be the something coming you referred to that can regalvanize the left, but that we're going into a period that is going to be one of, to use a scholarly term, social turmoil?
Right. Well, we're definitely going towards social turmoil. The problem is the left in this country was destroyed, the organized left. And we're basically starting from scratch at a very desperate moment. What happens, and this is always the collapse of empires, is that the elites finally start to cannibalize themselves. So what is it that starts the French Revolution? It's when Louis XVI revokes the patents for the nobles. He starts to steal from his own
support,
his own base of support. Right. And you see that with the corporate state by defrauding shareholders. You see it with Lehman Brothers, where a guy like Fuld, for personal profit, and he's worth a few $100 million, will trash his entire company and bring it down. And that process creates within the ruling elite tremendous amounts of cynicism, where you have an acceleration of just trying to steal as much as fast as you can on the way out the door.
Before it disappears.
Right. And that's where we are. And I, unfortunately got a scholarship to a lot of fancy schools, including prep schools, so I had to grow up with these rich bastards. And I know them. I know them on Wall Street, people who work for BlackRock and everywhere else. And that's what they're doing. They're stealing as much as fast as they can on the way out the door. So, we who care about an open society are at a severe disadvantage because, and that's another show, the whole psychosis of permanent war, starting with Woodrow Wilson in World War I, afterwards, in the name of anti-communism, all of our movements were destroyed. Our liberal institutions, universities were disemboweled. We don't even have, I think part of the reason you're so important is that we've been robbed of the language of class warfare by which we can even understand our own reality. And we have so much to do that it's worth going out and fighting for, but I think we have to be very hard-headed as to what we're up against.
All right. I think you'll agree with me that we've been very fortunate to have Chris here, and I hope I can count on you to come back and continue this conversation. In the time that remains, let me respond to a few of your questions. Again, please bear with us. We couldn't possibly deal with all the questions that you send to us, but they're extremely important, and we read and discuss every one. First question has to do with updating what has happened in France, because I had commented earlier that when the socialists took over the government last year in France on a program of anti-austerity, that I would keep up with how they're doing. Well, I think the answer is, on the one hand, on the other. There are ways in which the French socialists have kept up in their criticism of the way things were, in their reticence to go in the direction of austerity. And I gave an example earlier of controlling the salaries, for example, of the 52 companies in France where the government owns a majority of the shares. And they have taken other steps like that. But, to be honest, one also has to be very disappointed by the degree to which the French still stay in their alliance with the Germans, thereby imposing heavy restrictions on what all the impoverished governments and regimes of the south of Europe, Portugal, Greece, Spain, Italy, and so on, are facing, of the backtracking of the government in France on taxing the rich. That was overthrown in the courts, and the government hasn't moved very much on it. And so I guess the answer is the French government of socialists is torn. The mass of people clearly don't want any more austerity. But the business community and the banks, they want it. And the socialists are in between, clearly not having made up their mind whether they're going to go in either direction unambiguously. So it's a mixed report, and I will keep watching it to see what happens next. One of you asked about the recent revelations by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. I believe I have that name correct, the ICIJ. and you can follow their activities at icij.org. They recently released some very interesting documentation that they acquired about tax havens, or if you like, hidden money. Money that is taken by corporations and wealthy people who remove it from the countries in which they are based, locating it in banks, in offshore, elsewhere, other countries, in order to do three things, basically. One, to clean up the money if it has an illegal origin, if it's involved in activities where we call it money laundering, when you move it around so as to disguise where it came from. Number two, to avoid taxation, to escape taxes in their own country by creating an account or a shell corporation in another country. And third, to be able to engage in all kinds of business dealings, legal and illegal, out of the view of your own government, free of that scrutiny because it's all done in another. Where does this kind of thing happen? Well, we've known for a long time. Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, Switzerland. Now we know because of the collapse in Cyprus that it was a big place. Malta is another place, and there are many others. In the Western Hemisphere, the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, and so on. It turns out, as the ICIJ makes clear, that there are trillions, with a T, trillions of dollars squirreled away in these accounts all over the world. In the Cayman Islands and in Cyprus, for example, there's a zero profits tax. So a corporation that can show its profits occurring to its little subsidiary in some little account in Cyprus gets away with paying no taxes on it, rather than having those profits show up on the books in England where it would have to pay a big tax, or the United States where it would have to pay a big tax. And it turns out that it's the richest people and the biggest corporations that are busy doing it. And in fact, all the money center banks, Bank of America, Citibank, banks like that, that are busily setting up subsidiaries in all of these places in order to serve their clients who want to have an account there to escape taxes, to launder money, and to avoid being scrutinized by their governments. Why is this important? Well, two reasons immediately come to mind. Number one, we're having all these debates. Huge amounts of our otherwise taxable money has been moved out of our reach as a people. We may have a big discussion and pass a law in Washington about, but the people with the money are laughing all the way to their country club because they've moved their money out of the reach of the United States, no matter what tax rates it has, because they are exempted, because there's a loophole in the law that allows you to do that. Or maybe there isn't, but they do it anyway. So the bottom line is, if a government were really interested in not being in deficit, in raising a lot of money, the obvious logical choice would be to begin by getting a handle on where that money is, we already know, and how much is there, we already know. Go get it. Either by changing the law to remove the loophole, or by finding out how much of that is in violation of existing law. That would be a way to get the money from those who are the most suspect. And we have a precedent. In that terrible resolution of the crisis in Cyprus, the Europeans and the Cypriot government decided to take the money of wealthy Russians who had big accounts in Cyprus. And the argument was many of them may not have legally put it there. Whoa! If that's true in Cyprus and solves your problem for the Cyprus regime, gee, you could have a more general approach as well. Last question we have time for. How would taxation affect a worker-run enterprise? Here's the quick answer. Taxes today that are paid by corporations and rich people are used by them as a lever to make the government serve their needs, by cutting their taxes, by making the kinds of spending that they want. If we didn't have corporate boards of directors and we didn't have major shareholders because businesses were run and operated by the workers, guess what? The government, to raise taxes, would raise it on us as workers and then on us again as the collective owners, operators of enterprise. For the first time, government would be taxing us, and we would call the tune for what a government does, rather than having a small subset of the rich and powerful call those shots. Thank you, as always, for your attention. I'm sure you will agree with me. We had a special session today with Chris Hedges. This is Economic Update. I'm Richard Wolff, and I look forward to speaking with you again next week.